The Close-Up Foundation, in association with C-SPAN, takes you Close Up. This program is produced by the Close-Up Foundation and funded in part by grants from the DuPont Company and RJR Nabisco Incorporated.
Good afternoon and welcome to a special Close-Up teleconference on human rights. Joining us for our discussion today, a staff member for the United States Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, Ms. Catherine Cosman, and a professor at the School of International Services at the American University, Mr. Abdul Sahid. Hello, I'm John Milewski of the Close-Up Foundation. We'll be discussing human rights with Close-Up participants gathered in Salt Lake City, Utah, where they're participating in a Close-Up local program. And we'll also be taking your calls. If you're calling from the East Coast, the number is area code 202-628-2525. If you're calling from the West Coast, the phone number is the same area code, 202-783-2727. Now, before going to those calls, let's begin maybe by defining human rights, since that's the topic of our discussion, and different countries and different people have different definitions. Professor Sahid, let's begin with you.
Yes, John. Human rights is concerned with the dignity of the person and with the level of self-esteem that a person can have. And it's also concerned with an ecological balance, with a harmonious relationship between person, environment, including animals. Initially, when we defined human rights, we thought way back in the 40s with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the major concern was with political rights, economic rights. But increasingly, we have become equally concerned with ecological rights. And that involves the whole planet. So it deals with dignity, with balance, with ecology, with self-esteem, with identity, with community. That's how I see it.
Ms. Cosman.
Well, I think I would take a more political slant on it, in the sense that I think on a practical level it has a lot to do with the relationship between the individual and his or her government. And in that sense we can talk about some of the rights that Professor Said outlined, political and civil, but also, of course, economic and social. And if you look at the various components of these rights as spelled out in international documents, I think it really gives you a pretty broad scope for the legal basis for an individual to feel secure in his or herself, and also gives them the basis to enjoy a full life. Traditionally, of course, governments in the East have traditionally emphasized economic and social, and Western governments have emphasized civil and political. I think this is one of the areas of conflict that we'll probably get into more.
But that's true, Kathy. Those of us who are involved in human rights on an academic or active level, as activists, increasingly find it difficult to separate political from economic, social, cultural. They are indivisible. Governments do that separation for practical purposes. We in the West, we emphasize political rights. They, whoever they are, in Eastern Europe, emphasize economic rights. But in both cases, governments are using that separation as a way of reflecting certain political interests.
Sure.
They cannot be separated. But I agree with what you are saying. There are those of us who become more involved in the political, but they are all equally important. I mean, how people, Eastern Europeans many times tell me, look here, we are more concerned with economic rights. My answer to them, how a people organize themselves politically cannot be differentiated and unrelated from whether or not they eat. The two are interconnected.
I think another area that we as Americans sometimes overlook, and again that East Europeans consider very important, and in other parts of the world as well, is more not a collective idea of human rights, but rather the question of cultural rights for ethnic and national groups.
Right.
I'm sure we'll have plenty of opportunities to add to the definitions as the show goes on, but right now let's go to Salt Lake City, Utah in our first question. Go ahead, please. You're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Hello. My name is David Turner, Salt Lake City. I'm interested in the effect that the press has on the institution of human rights in other countries. Do you see the press having an effect on those countries?
Ms. Cosman, let's begin with you, the influence of the press on human rights in other countries, even in this country.
Of course, it's no secret that we live in a media age, and very often our perceptions of what a country is like, or what the problems of a given group are, or the situation of an individual, is formed by the media. So very often, if the media decides to emphasize or not to publicize at all a given problem, it can define whether or not a public in a given area or a national public opinion sees that there's a problem in the given area at all. And of course, all of us who are involved with human rights work wish that the media would pay more attention to the problems of human rights in general and specifically as well.
Professor Saeed, how do you see the role of the press?
Just continuing from the perspective that Kathy has identified, which is totally accurate, then we have the following situation. We have a situation where governments control media, not in the United States, but in many areas, in the third world, in Eastern Europe. So here we have that influence. What becomes identified in press or in print media or other media is very much a function of a decision by the government. In our case, in the West, mainly in the United States, it's a function of commercialism, meaning our media is pretty commercial. It depends on the market. Access to airtime is very much determined not by the intrinsic value of the issue, but by how media defines it at any given time. So certainly there's a very real connection between media and human rights, and a great deal needs to be done. Media has to exercise its own monitoring. We must not advocate a situation where government interferes in media. That would be unacceptable. But media has to exercise responsibility in focusing on issues that are important issues without its own selection of what it considers to be important.
Let's take a call now from New York City. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yes. It seems that this administration talks a lot about human rights, but in reality, we are not doing anything. The major source of the problems that we have overseas, especially in the Middle East, have to do, I believe, with the human rights of the Palestinian people, who have been completely, abused and displaced, evicted from their homes. So that is, I believe, a very salient point that we must deal first and give an example to the world that we are fair. And all this terror, George Shultz, for instance, just said that terrorism is always the main thing. But I think that if we addressed a fair approach to Israel and to the Palestinian thing, it would completely help the human rights situation worldwide.
Former President Jimmy Carter has been critical of Reagan administration policies, and particularly in the Middle East, and has said that until the Palestinians are included. Professor Saeed, would you like to comment?
Yes, both ways, but maybe the comment on the response or the attitude of the U.S. government could come maybe more from Kathy than from myself. But I'll be happy to comment on both. Definitely, the issue of the Palestinian is one that no American president has been willing to address. I have served on President Carter's Commission for the Islamic World, and it's unfair of President Carter to kind of discount himself as not having a responsibility. He certainly was not as eager or as sensitive to Palestinian rights when he was President of the United States. It is easier for him at this time to be critical of President Reagan. No American president has a monopoly over insensitivity to human rights of the Palestinians. They have all been equally insensitive. The Palestinian has no access to justice, be it internationally, regionally, locally. The Palestinian has no access to their day in court, so to speak. The Palestinians have been refused a hearing. And hence, when a person encounters near total absence of access to justice, to a day in court, then what happens to them? They become terrorists. This is no justification of terrorism, this is an explanation. Unfortunately, what happens in media, when media looks at terrorism, media looks at the event as having occurred now. Who has done what to whom, overlooking the context. Terrorism has a context. Terrorism has a cause, and media, together with our government here, we are responding to symptoms rather than to causes, and the Palestinian has received no justice, none whatsoever. I mean, literally, the Palestinian has no access to any court, if one may want to use the word court, nor does the Palestinian have access to decision-making. I mean, the Palestinians are shut out of the system. They are shut out of the Israeli system. They are shut out of the Arab system. They are shut out of the international system. They are exploited by everyone. It's a tragic case.
Ms. Cosman.
Well, as to the present administration's human rights policies, I work for a bipartisan governmental group, so I'll just state the facts as I see them, which is that there has been under, I guess the department in the State Department began under President Carter, namely the Bureau of Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs, and that department continues strong to this day and issues a lot of reports which are worldwide in scope and very detailed in their exposition of problem areas wherever they occur. I think, to some extent it's a difference in style between President Carter and President Reagan. President Reagan, I think particularly increasingly lately, has put more emphasis on quiet diplomacy. I think we can see the release of Anatoly Sharansky as part of that effort in a general sort of way. I wanted to mention something about what I consider the Soviet version or the Soviet case where they have a situation which I think is very similar to that of the Palestinians, namely also a Muslim group inside the Soviet Union called the Crimean Tatars. They and, well, about 10 other ethnic groups were accused without any evidence by Stalin of traitorship and collaboration with the Nazis, and they were deported during World War II in cattle cars to areas in Central Asia away from their traditional homelands. Some of these groups have been allowed, after much difficulty, to return to their traditional areas inside the Soviet Union, but several of these groups have not, including 500,000 Crimean Tatars who, to this day, are still in their places of exile in Central Asia. And even though they have mounted peaceful petition campaigns for many years, asking the Soviet authorities to be allowed to return to their homeland along the Black Sea in the Crimea, to this day they're not allowed to, and several of their leaders are imprisoned and have spent most of their adult lives in Soviet camps.
Now,
if I may comment on that, what Kathy's saying is true and correct. My perspective on that, it doesn't matter who does what to whom, the act is wrong. And I'm becoming a bit concerned that anytime those of us who talk about human rights of Palestinians or others vis-a-vis the West, Americans or Westerns talk about human rights of Muslims in the Soviet Union. I would hate to be a Muslim in the Soviet Union, as I would hate to be an Arab in Israel as I would hate to be a Jew in Baghdad, so to speak. I think we have to be honest in discussing human rights. The act is unacceptable. Who does it to whom is not the issue. Because oftentimes when I talk about human rights with Iranians now, I was involved in investigating human rights violations under the Shah. And I tell the Iranians today, look, we can't even investigate human rights violations under Khomeini. They said, but this is different. This is for God and country. I said, it doesn't matter. What matters is the act. The act is wrong. Some people seem to think who does it to whom is a justification. No, it's no justification. The violations of the Palestinians are not justified, nor are the violations of the human rights of the Muslims in the Soviet Union justified. It's unacceptable. I think we have to begin to depoliticize the dialogue on human rights. So long as it is political, you and I may feel a visceral satisfaction, but people are suffering. People are dying from hunger, from oppression, whether they are Jews, Muslims, Arabs, Chinese, it doesn't matter. For us, politically, it begins to matter to justify our ideological positions. But it doesn't matter. They are people. And you are right. The Muslims in the Soviet Union are not doing well. Their rights are pretty much violated. Rights of worship, movement. Oh, sure, once in a while a Muslim is appointed in a high position in government. Yeah.
When I made my comment, I didn't mean to, say that one wrong justified another, but simply that this situation is not well known, and I wanted to use the opportunity to.
Well, I'm happy you did. I mean, for the sake of the Muslims in the Soviet
Maybe this
Union.
is a good example of where the emphasis of the press has been and where it hasn't been in a similar situation. Let's go now to Salt Lake City for our next question. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Glenn Johnson, Salt Lake City. You believe that our current administration is supportive of the human rights of our citizens?
Human rights right here in our own country. Is the Reagan administration supportive of human rights in the country? Ms. Cosman, let's begin with you.
That's a tough one, I guess I would say. I think certainly the present administration feels very much that we are, this is a free market system, and has, its policies have been oriented towards that. I think perhaps, the unemployed people in this country feel that they're kind of left behind, and to which the response is usually, well, let the state programs look after these people. I'm not sure that those programs are adequate, but certainly economic growth does seem to be proceeding at a good pace, at least for certain areas of the country. I personally, worry about what happens to the family farms and what's happening to people in the so-called Rust Belt area who do need retraining in new areas of technology.
Well, my feeling, my perspective is pretty clear about that. The present administration demonstrates glaring insensitivity to human rights of minorities, to issues of poverty, to issues that have to deal with the whole area of health and ecology. Definitely, I mean, and more recently, my human rights are being violated as an Arab American. The hysterical attitude that has been emanating from the White House and from Congress about Arabs, Arab Americans. I have been encountering violations of my own human rights. Recently, I returned to the United States from the Middle East, and I was singled out for search. I am a U.S. citizen. I have been teaching for 30 years. I have served on presidential commissions, human rights of Arabs all over the stereotyping of Arabs. It is not different from the way Jews have been stereotyped in the past and the present, blacks and others. Arabs' rights are being violated. Blacks' rights are being violated. There's an insensitivity, and the attitude of the administration is that, no, it's not there. I mean, the attitude of the administration, the present administration, is that human rights are in the eyes of the beholder. No, there's something more concrete than that. There's certainly an insensitivity to ecology, seeing what's happening with the whole area of changes in rules and regulations regarding the environment. Certainly the human rights of my students who increasingly their financial support is decreasing on the pretext that some middle-class Americans have been exploiting the financial assistance to students and what have you. And how about poverty and hunger? I feel pretty clear about that, and I think we as Americans ought to be very concerned that a great deal of damage is being done, and it's going to take a while to redress that damage in the years to come.
Our next call is from Eugene, Oregon. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Okay.
Oh, you'll have to turn the sound down on your television set, please.
Yeah, I'm working on it. I have a automatic control here that doesn't work real fast. I am particularly impressed by the democratizing factors that are coming into the media now through C-SPAN and this program, and I think you do an excellent job. I want to say that I think it's the biggest step forward in telecommunications to inform people to make the kind of decisions that we can have peace in the world and we can have real justice. In response to what the gentleman just said, I've been paying real close attention to what is happening with Native Americans in this country. And there's a very big issue that is coming up on the 6th of July. A whole host of people are being removed forcibly from their land in the Four Corners area. And the media has not even touched this. And this is a disgrace, I think, because these are the people who were here originally. They have a whole culture and a whole spirit about them that is very definitely high-level order if you take the time to look at it. And their ecological perspective is so far superior to the industrial go and grab it, make a bundle mentality that is fostered and influences the media because it is commercial. Community television stations are now in a position where social issue groups can really make good use of them. And I would like to see and hope that C-SPAN and people like yourself, the panel there, would really start encouraging anybody they know to get the best programming they can on community television and have a grassroots movement in this country, because commercial television, I think, is sold out to very big money. And our agricultural situation has certainly been influenced by the Agricultural Commerce Committee back in the late 40s that decided the family farm was out, and they over-mechanized, over-industrialized farming, which is an art. It's a cultural art. It's not something that you just go in and rape the soil and inject in very symbolic forms anhydrous ammonia into the surface of the soil so that when you get a drought or you get wet weather, the root systems die because they don't go down into the soil. I mean, all these things are complex issues, and the media as it stands under the guise of the rulership of huge corporate interests don't give us a full perspective on what's really going on. And I would like the people there to comment on that.
Okay, would anyone like to comment?
Well, certainly I agree that the democratizing, as the caller put it, influence of C-SPAN and community TV is really great. And I think it's always good to have an opportunity for people in various parts of the country to call and communicate in the way that we're doing right now. And on a serious level, not just, sensationalizing, catching up with the latest in topic.
Well, this is, again, I'm in agreement with Kathy, and I feel the concern and the pain of the person asking us a question. And this goes back to media having to exercise responsibility. It is true, it is partly a function of the commercialism of media. It's commercial, it's market economy. But it's partly the way we train our media people in universities, in schools. I mean, let's face it, I'm at a university where we have a distinguished school of journalism. And we train them the way they come out. And the way they come out is your concern ought to be with stories, and first story, access to the first story, the person who gets the first story, and scooping. Media is involved in doing it that way, but who defines for media, what media decides is partly the market, partly the training, partly the big corporation, definitely the market. And how do we deal with them? We deal with them partly on a level of training. The other one, responsibility on the part of media. Media insists, and rightly so, that no governmental intervention. But the other side of that is responsibility. And they have not demonstrated that responsibility. Media has not.
Let's return to Salt Lake City, Utah for our next question. Go ahead, please.
Yes, this is Justin Stewart in Salt Lake City. My question is, would you let us comment on the fact that these recent incidents in Chernobyl apparently went on without really any information, accurate information from the Soviet Union for quite a number of days. Would you tell us how we're supposed to get accurate information on things like human rights in the Soviet Union and how the Soviet government functions with these matters, particularly human rights?
Let's put that in the context of a human rights question. Did the Soviet Union violate its people's rights in the Chernobyl nuclear accident? Ms. Cosman, let's begin with you.
I don't think there's much doubt about that. I think that, in fact, I know that the Soviet Union traditionally has a very simple information policy, which is literally that no news is good news. I think this very sad incident should show the world that the way in which the Soviet Union treats information of all kinds, namely that it is the privilege of the government to hold as much information, particularly about unpleasant events, tragedies, natural disasters, plane crashes, and then to dispense that information as it sees fit, you know, in sort of little doses to the rest of the world if it is pushed. I think there's a lot of evidence to show that if the Swedes hadn't recorded these these sudden increases in their radiation levels, that we never would have heard about the accident in Chernobyl. There's also evidence that first they tried to blame it on the local authorities, that the local authorities didn't act swiftly enough to notify Moscow about the serious situation. And then evidence has also been coming out that they waited sometimes 10 days to evacuate people from the immediate area of the accident. Unfortunately, to me, it doesn't come as much of a surprise because living in the Soviet Union, you see the way in which ordinary people there are treated with very little respect. And health measures, even though there is free health care, it's at a very low level. Medical technology is also at a very low level, as is the drug industry. And this incident, the way in which the people were treated, evacuation procedures, all shows this, unfortunately, all too clearly.
Yes, the Soviet government violated the rights of the Russian people.
And the Ukrainian.
And the Ukrainian people. And our rights all over the world. You see, what we have to begin to recognize is that information is not anymore a private good, it's a public good. And as a public good, we do need a new international information order. It is a public good, as water is a public good, as the air that we breathe is a public good. And we have to begin to change the way we think, all of us. We Americans officially have been opposed to the notion of a new international information order. We have to begin to explore that things have to change, that the way information is handled has to change, because we are all affected by what has happened over there. Now, we as Americans must not, however, disassociate ourselves from the dishonesties of information, because our government does the same. When we have had our difficult situations, our tragedies, our government did not handle the situation much more effectively or much more openly. Then, at that time, thanks to media was able to catch our government and try to provide us with the information. But governments are not in the business of telling the truth, unfortunately. Some governments tell more lies than other governments. Some governments have more constraints upon them. But the Russians violated the rights of the Russian people, the Ukrainian, the Europeans, the Americans, and the rights of the fish and the trees and everyone else. Yes, and they stand guilty.
Before we return to Salt Lake City, let me remind our viewers that you are watching a special close-up teleconference on human rights. We've been joined by Professor Abdul Saeed, professor at the School of International Service at the American University here in Washington, D.C. Mr. Saeed is a lecturer at the Foreign Service Institute, has traveled on lecture tours for the State Department and the International Communications Agency. Professor Saeed is also the author of numerous publications. Also, Catherine Cosman, a professional staff member for the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe. Ms. Cosman monitors, writes articles, and prepares briefing materials on human rights in the Soviet Union. Ms. Cosman is also a radio commentator on Soviet society and has published a number of articles on oppression in the Soviet Union. We've been taking calls and comments from viewers around the nation and also from a group of close-up participants gathered in Salt Lake City, Utah, where they've been taking part in a close-up local program. And now let's return to Salt Lake City for our next question. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
This is Leora Berry from Salt Lake City, and I wanted to make a few comments on the human rights right here in the United States. Living in the West, where we have so many of our Indian tribes, and we have not met the human rights of these people who live right around us. And I'm thinking right now of the Indian school that was in Brigham City, and we were educating many from many tribes. These children were brought in where they were receiving their education. They closed the Indian school. Now they're turning it into a golf course. Also, I'm thinking about down on the Four Corners, where they are moving people against their wishes out of there. And then I go back and I think about the human rights that we violated when we went into the war after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, when we gathered up all the Japanese Japanese descent, even though they were American citizens, and put them in, well, we say to Russia that they send them out somewhere. We put them all in an encampment, and we kept them there throughout the whole. They were loyal citizens of our country, giving, and they were kept there. And if that is human rights, I don't think it is as far as I am concerned.
Would anyone like to comment?
Lady is right, Ms. Berry is right. I mean, about what is happening to Indians, American Indians. Of course, someone could respond by saying, but compare this to how other original peoples have been treated in other societies. That's not the issue. The issue is what we are doing in our own society here. And this has to do with what is perceived to be the imperatives of progress and technology. In the name of progress and technology, we have been doing a number of things to American Indians, leaving aside the political issues. And the time has come for social control over technology, a technology that's calibrated, a progress that's calibrated to human beings, a progress that's calibrated to infants, to Indians, to Jews, to Chinese, to Spanish-speaking Americans. Our technology and our notion of progress needs an agonizing reappraisal. We have to begin to calibrate that to human beings. Not mentioning the historical past of what has happened to Indians. It is a real issue, and the present administration is not unique in its reaction. Other administrations have not been much better than the present administration. The present administration, however, if it has a distinguishing characteristic regarding human rights, it has an attitude of Marie Antoinette, of not caring. Unfortunately, there's a certain, it goes beyond insensitivity. There's a certain sense of arrogance that is more than insensitivity, and that concerns me as an American. It does.
Ms. Cosman, would you like to comment?
Well, certainly what happened to the Japanese Americans was a tragedy, and I'm sure the effects are still felt by those families. And I'm glad that the government has recognized that it was a tragic error and has, made some steps to redress the situation.
Has the government done enough in that situation?
Well, I haven't followed as closely as I should have, but, they have done something. I mean, when one gets to the question of monetary compensation, I suppose one can say nothing is ever enough, since money never compensates for suffering.
Let's go to San Antonio, Texas for our next question. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yes, hello there. I'm calling from San Antonio for Professor Saeed. And first, I'd like to thank you, Professor, for your very thoughtful and compassionate responses to the questions regarding the violations of the human rights of Palestinians. And I wanted to ask you a question regarding the violations of human rights against these people in Israel, especially in the occupied territories. A lot of the human rights-related groups, such as the International Committee of the Red Cross and Amnesty International and the National Conference of Black Lawyers and other individuals have documented evidence of torture that is going on in the Israeli prisons. And I'm wondering why there is virtually nothing appearing in the United States media about the tremendous violations of human rights of the Arabs in these areas. And I'm wondering if perhaps the Israeli lobby, which suppresses debate on these issues, is indeed the responsible party in this lack of information. And I thank you very much, sir.
For many years now, those of us who have been involved in the human rights community have been kind of tortured as we look at the Middle East. What has been happening in the case of Israel and Palestinians in the occupied territories? There has been a tendency for many years now in the human rights community that we should leave Israel alone. That if you begin to raise questions about Palestinians in occupied areas, you are going to antagonize all sorts of people internationally. There has been more or less, almost in quotation, a gentleman's agreement, and I'm not being sexist when I say gentleman, a people's agreement, so to speak, that we treat Israel with kid gloves about human rights. This, thank God, has been changing recently. You are quite correct. The Palestinian in the occupied territory has been subjected to indignities, torture, many reports, even the most recent report submitted to the Congress of the United States by the Department of State. Certainly, it has been documented. Why have we not dealt with it? We have not dealt with it traditionally because that has been a political issue. It has become political. We need to depoliticize the issue of the Palestinians. The Palestinians are people, above and beyond politics. They are suffering, and I know many times when I express my thinking and thoughts about Palestinians, someone asks me the question, how about Jews? Same situation. Any violation of the human rights of Jews in the Soviet Union and any other area in Arab states has to be condemned with equal fervor and has to be rectified, has to be changed. You are correct. Another thing, the pro-Israeli lobby in the United States makes it near impossible for people to talk about violations of human rights of Palestinians. Immediately you get the accusation of what? Of being anti-Semitic. My sense is the following. Israel is a state. Judaism is a faith. Zionism is a political movement. I can and anyone should be able to criticize Israel as they can criticize Syria or Lebanon or the US or Soviet Union. Any person can criticize Zionism as they can and should criticize Arab nationalism, democracy, or what have you. Judaism is a faith. That's separate. And we ought to be respectful of the faith, be it Jewish, be it Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, Confucius, be it even atheist. So we have to begin to be honest. I agree with Joe Egger, the director of the United Nations Symphony, who has in public and in writing stated that we have to begin to be honest about Palestinians and Israelis. And we have to have guts. We have to have courage. Many people are indeed intimidated for fear that should they express their view about Israel, a critical view, they will be accused of anti-Semitic. They will be accused, and that has to stop. Otherwise, it's creating many men and women and human beings who become closet anti-Semites. And there's nothing more dangerous than a closet anti-Semite. And by a closet anti-Semite, someone who is indeed anti-Semitic privately but publicly adopts a totally different attitude. And those are the men and women that we have to be cautious of.
Ms. Cosman, would you care to comment?
Well, I'll make a personal comment, which is that I agree that the Palestinian problem does cry out for resolution and has for a long time, and that there should be more reporting about that situation.
Let's go back to Salt Lake City now for our next question. Go ahead, please.
Okay, 75.
Salt Lake City, you're on the air.
This is Mary Coulter from Salt Lake City, Utah. What should the United States do, which it is not doing, to further the human rights of citizens of other countries?
What more can the United States do? We've talked about the policy of the Carter administration, which was a bit more overt, and Ronald Reagan's policy of quiet diplomacy, I believe, is what we've talked about. Ms. Cosman, what more can we do? And I think you're involved in some of the things that we do.
Well, I know there's long been this debate, what is more effective, quiet diplomacy or public diplomacy? I think the work of the Commission and my experience both have shown that both are effective and both need to be applied in every given situation. However, depending on the country with which you're dealing, and obviously I have almost exclusively experience dealing with the Soviet Union, my impression, so I can only speak of impressions vis-a-vis other countries. For some countries, especially countries with which we are closely allied, quiet diplomacy should be used more, but I mean really used, not just, use that as an excuse for not doing anything. Because in those cases we have more genuine leverage, if we're willing to use it, on, trade agreements or various kinds of bilateral arrangements which we have with those governments. So in those cases, I think a combination of public and private diplomacy should be used, with the emphasis on private diplomacy. With countries like the Soviet Union or China or Eastern Europe, countries with which we do not have such a close relationship, then I think the formula should be reversed, that there should be more emphasis on public diplomacy, but private diplomacy should also be conducted. I think what more could we be doing? Obviously informing ourselves better about situations all over the world. And again, applying this combination of private and public diplomacy. I think as Americans, we're very oriented towards quick fixes. And we want, to fix a situation really quickly and hope that, we write 2 letters about a problem, say if we're in an amnesty group or whatever, and we hope that that will take care of it. But most of these problems are very difficult. They are very sensitive aspects of those countries' societies and politics. So you have to apply effort over a long period of time and not expect results very quickly. And then, of course, there's the distinction between action on an individual level and action for larger groups of people, say the problems of religious believers in various countries, say the Baha'i in Iran, every religious group in the Soviet Union and many countries of Eastern Europe. So if we discuss issues, problem areas as well as the problems of individuals, I hope in the long run we can make progress, but it's not quick.
Professor Saeed, what more can we do?
We can be justly fulfilled in a way that our government and our nation has taken the lead in responding to human rights internationally, going back to our Foreign Assistance Acts of 1973. The legislation is in the books, and the Congress of the United States, to the credit of the United States, has adopted a number of laws, a good deal of legislation, a good deal of which has been implemented. Some of it at this present time is more or less suspended, is not being implemented. So one response to your question is we have a good precedent. We have had a good beginning. What are some of the things we can do now? A number of things. Our government can explore through the United Nations the establishment of an international commissioner for human rights. As we have an international commissioner for refugees. There's a need for that. It has been discussed. And we ought to support that as Americans. It's good for us, it's good for them, it's good for the whole world. Not that an international commission for human rights will solve all the problems, but definitely there is something there that can happen, and we should support that. Why is it we are not through the United Nations and a new office, an International Commissioner for Human Rights. Second, our government, through the United Nations, could support the establishment of an international criminal court. There is no international criminal court. To try and to take issues with our violations of human rights. I'm not referring to the International Court of Justice. That can happen. We could do that. We could support that as a government. Write to your congressman and senator, why can't we explore the possibility of setting up through the United Nations an international criminal court? A third thing, we can also, through the United Nations, begin to support the establishment of international grievance agencies to look at issues of human rights violations. We don't have international grievance agencies. We can, and this is a clincher. Let us begin to talk about transfer of weapons internationally, because a good deal of the rights of people internationally are violated. There's a direct linkage between human rights violations and weapons, transfers of weapons, expenditures of weapons. Our government should begin to explore the possibility of negotiating an international agreement to limit the transfer of conventional weapons. Now, I know the Russians won't like it maybe, and the French and the Brazilians and the British, but then we'll call the shots. We'll say, okay, let's begin to do something there. And another thing we can do, as a government, we can support the establishment of regional organizations to deal with human rights violations. In the Organization of Americans, to encourage regional responses to human rights through our participation and support. There's a great deal that can be done. What is needed at this time really is a rethinking, because what we believe determines what we see as reality. And many of us have concluded there's nothing we can do. We can do a great deal about human rights. We certainly can.
Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Hello, this is Marie Springer in Salt Lake City. I want to go back to the question of the UN. Why is it that we are ignoring the issues of human rights? They're not being addressed in the UN, which was the intent of the 1945 founders of the UN. Could you further discuss that?
Why hasn't the UN paid more attention?
Ms. Springer, what is happening in the United Nations when it comes to human rights is that the governments of the third world, as well as the superpowers, have a common interest, in a way, a common interest in not addressing the issues. Human rights violations are much more rampant and more glaring in third world societies. And if you want to get third world governments in the United Nations to talk about human rights, most of them would not want to discuss it. And we have found cause, we Americans and the Russians, in kind of taking sides with this or that third world government, and hence there isn't an incentive. It is not a profitable business to do in the United Nations. This is one area. Of course, third world governments in the United Nations will condemn American imperialism or Russian imperialism, but when it comes to issues of human rights, they themselves are guilty. And that's one of the real issues. And we Americans and Russians and other superpowers do take sides. We either take the side of the government of El Salvador, or they will take the side of the government of Nicaragua, be it in the Western Hemisphere or in the Middle East. One superpower will take side with one and the other superpower with the other. That has been the issue. It is unfortunate. But the United Nations, the members of the United Nations, have little or no incentive.
Ms. Cosman, does the Commission work much with the United Nations?
No, we don't. The Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe deals solely with the human rights elements and some other provisions, but of the 1975 Helsinki Final Act, which was signed by all of the countries of Europe except Albania, plus Canada and the United States. But I should add that in the Helsinki context, there's a lot of discussion of human rights, and some people say that this is, one of the most valuable aspects of this agreement, because it does allow countries to exchange very freely, literally sitting across the table from each other, discussions on a serious as well as occasionally very polemical level, human rights and other problems.
Time for one more quick question from Salt Lake City. Go ahead, please. You're on the air, and you'll have to be brief.
We have someone stepping to the phone right at this moment.
Okay.
This is Barbara Fair from Salt Lake City. I'm concerned that the government seemingly ignores the church groups who have been working at grassroots levels in I'm thinking particularly of Central America here, for a long time in trying to improve through education, you know, the poverty in the country, enabling the people to be able to develop, and why the government is putting such a terrible push for military aid and seemingly not sufficient economic aid for those countries.
We'll have to have very brief answers. 30 seconds, Ms. Cosman.
I think the government recognizes a lot of the valuable work that the church groups have been doing. I guess it sees the problem as much broader than that.
It's true. That's true, yeah. There's increasing recognition by the U.S. government about their role, and more has to be done.
I'd like to thank both of our guests, Ms. Cosman and Mr. Saeed, for joining us for this discussion on human rights. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Also, thanks to our participants in Salt Lake City for your fine questions. Also, to all of you who called in to participate in today's program. If you would like more information on Close Up, our program for older Americans, or our television programs, please stay tuned immediately following this program for our address and toll-free number. Once again, thank you for joining us. Please join us again for our next program. For Professor Saeed, Ms. Cosman, I'm John Milewski of the Close Up Foundation. Thank you and good afternoon.